No, this cannot be. I am so sorry.
In the room, illuminated by cold hospital lights, the silence seemed to weigh more heavily than any word spoken so far. The man, dressed in an impeccable suit, held the document with trembling hands, trying to absorb every line of the truth that had just been laid before his eyes. Beside him, the woman who swore she had given birth to the company's heir maintained a hard yet uneasy expression, as if hoping it was all just a printing error. But the one reading aloud, her face pale and her eyes filled with pain, was the very one who had been discarded months ago, humiliated in silence, forgotten without explanation. Throughout the pregnancy, the businessman had made a point of showing off his new partner, proud to finally have a son to carry on the family name. Contracts had been updated, the media celebrated the birth, and shareholders received official communications confirming the continuation of the legacy. Everything seemed under control until the test result arrived. The letters on the paper left no room for doubt. The truth, cold and indisputable, came like a sentence no one expected. The baby he had registered, claimed, and announced to the world as his heir was not his. And worse, the one he ignored, unknowingly, belonged to the woman he had abandoned in the past, and to whom he never said a word, out of respect or grief. And now, with the truth exposed and shocked looks on everyone's faces, only one question remained. How many lives had been destroyed? By trusting too much in someone who knew how to lie by looking them in the eye? If this revelation touched you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that no one imagines, but everyone needs to hear. Years before that humiliating day in the hospital, the story of Lee Jun-seok and Lee Hye-jin seemed like something out of a modern fairy tale. He was the young heir to a powerful conglomerate, educated at Korea's top universities and groomed from an early age to take over as president of the family company. She, the daughter of Daegu professors, had earned her place with hard work and dedication, and met Jun-seok at an academic conference in Seoul, where her intelligence caught his attention more than anything else. What began as professional admiration quickly blossomed into a romance that, to everyone's eyes, seemed destined for success. Their marriage was celebrated as a strategic and romantic union at once. Business magazines and society columns never tired of extolling the image of the perfect couple. He, the brilliant executive who rose like a meteor. She, the devoted wife who gracefully juggled the role of hostess at corporate events and that of a simple woman, still faithful to her roots. Hye-jin was known for accompanying her husband every step of the way, reviewing contracts with him until late at night, caring for her ailing father-in-law and keeping the house spotless, even when her own needs were neglected. Behind the spotlight, however, the dynamics were already beginning to reveal fissures that would later become chasms. Jun-seok, enchanted by the prominent position he had achieved, began to distance himself emotionally from his wife. With each business victory, he became colder, more demanding, less willing to see the woman at his side as a partner, and more inclined to see her as someone who merely performed functions. Hye-jin, for her part, endured the silence and absence, believing that the distance was temporary and that the man she had fallen in love with still existed beneath the layers of ambition that grew unchecked. She painfully remembered nights preparing meals while waiting for him to return, only to hear that an urgent meeting had stretched into the wee hours. She also recalled the times he'd scolded her for meddling in company decisions, even when her observations were correct. Still, Hye-jin insisted on standing firm, convinced that her role was to support him, even at the cost of her own happiness. What no one imagined was that this emotional vacuum would open the way for another woman, opportunistic and calculating, to find a way to infiltrate. And it was precisely in this fertile ground of disregard and arrogance that Baek Ji-yeon would emerge, changing the course of that story forever. It was in this moment of emotional distance between husband and wife that Baek Ji-yeon appeared subtly, almost like a shadow taking advantage of a poorly lit room. An employee of one of the company's departments, headed by Lee Jun-seok, she had gained a certain notoriety for her eloquence in meetings and her ability to turn problems into opportunities to shine. What for many was simply professional ambition, for Ji-yeon was part of a calculated plan aimed not only at social advancement, but also at occupying a space never intended for her. Their connection began almost innocently. Quick conversations in the hallways, well-timed smiles, glances that lingered a little longer than was acceptable. Jun-seok, already intoxicated by his own vanity, felt flattered to realize how unconditionally this young woman seemed to admire him. Unlike Hye-jin, who dared to question his decisions in the name of balance and justice, Ji-yeon always agreed, always praised, always made every word seem like absolute truth. It was the perfect fodder for an ego that grew faster than his conscience. Over time, the encounters stopped being casual. Business meetings extended into private dinners. Corporate trips turned into discreet romantic getaways, and what began as a poorly kept secret became a rumor uncontainable within the company walls. Employees whispered in the hallways, partners exchanged uncomfortable glances, and the press began to sniff out something beyond the impeccable image Jun-seok so zealously cultivated. About that, Lee Hye-jin, already pregnant, noticed that her husband was returning home later and later, with the scent of someone else's perfume lingering on his jacket. Her attempts at dialogue were met with coldness or irony. "You're paranoid," he would say, without even looking her in the eye, as if it were absurd to believe a wife could feel when she was no longer loved. Her heart bled silently, but her dignity prevented her from begging for attention. Ji-yeon, on the other hand, advanced as if she knew exactly what she was doing. She knew how to be delicate and vulnerable when she wanted to awaken Jun-seok's protective instinct, but she also knew how to be firm and calculating, hinting that she could do for him what no one else would. It was like a perverse game in which every piece was carefully positioned to push Hye-jin off the board. When the rumors became inevitable, Jun-seok no longer made a point of denying them. Instead, he seemed proud to discreetly show off his new partner during private gatherings, making it clear to everyone that Hye-jin was merely a shadow of a past he wanted to bury. His wife, pregnant and increasingly isolated, became the target of pitying glances, as if she were merely the discarded woman who couldn't hold on to the powerful man. But if up until that point the humiliations had been silent, the greatest was yet to come. Because Jun-seok wouldn't be content to simply ignore Hye-jin, he would make a point of making an example of her before all of Korean society. The Seoul Federation of Business People's annual grand event was awaited as the highlight of the social calendar. In that hall, illuminated by crystal chandeliers and filled with figures from the political and economic elite, camera flashes multiplied with each distinguished guest's entrance. But no moment of that evening would be as talked about as the scene starring Lee Jun-seok. Wearing a tailored suit and with the confident expression of someone who believed he had the world at his feet, Jun-seok entered hand in hand with Baek Ji-yeon, who wore a long red dress designed to draw attention and evoke an uncomfortable reminder of who had been replaced. Conversations ceased for a few seconds, leaving the room in a heavy silence until whispers and whispers began to spread like wildfire. Everyone knew this was the first event at which Ji-yeon had officially appeared alongside the CEO, no longer as a rumor, but as confirmation. Among the guests was Lee Hye-jin, still trying to preserve a modicum of dignity. She had been persuaded by a friend to attend, believing it might be important to maintain some social connection even amidst her impending divorce. Little did she know that that night would become the milestone of her greatest public humiliation. When the MC called Jun-seok onto the stage to announce a new phase for the company, the CEO firmly gripped the microphone and, instead of limiting himself to talking about investments and achievements, decided to reveal to everyone the definitive change in his personal life. With a firm look into the cameras and the shareholders watching him, he declared, "Today I'm not just celebrating the success of my company, I'm also celebrating the arrival of a new life, the legitimate heir that will soon be born from the love between me and the woman by my side, Baek Ji-yeon." The hall erupted in embarrassed applause. Some tried to hide their surprise, others gave mechanical smiles, but everyone felt the cruel impact of the words. To heighten the spectacle, Jun-seok lifted Ji-yeon's hand and kissed it in front of everyone, as if sealing not only a commitment, but also the annulment of the woman who had been his wife. Lee Hye-jin, sitting among guests who averted their eyes to avoid facing her pain, felt the ground give way beneath her feet. She was pregnant, but to the man who had shared her life until recently, that pregnancy seemed meaningless. Every round of applause echoed like a blow to his soul. Every flash of the cameras recorded not only his lover's triumph, but the annihilation of her dignity. And as if that weren't enough, at the end of his speech, Jun-seok approached Hye-jin's table and, before attentive eyes, placed an envelope containing the divorce papers on the white tablecloth. His voice sounded cold, almost impersonal. "It's time for everyone to go their own way." Her face burning and her hands trembling, Hye-jin took the envelope but couldn't say anything. She simply stood up amidst the pitying and judgmental gazes and walked out of the hall like a shadow among the figures of high society. The weight of that night wasn't just the separation, it was the fact that she had been exposed as disposable before all who had once applauded their union. However, fate, which until then seemed cruel, was silently paving the way for a path that would transform that pain into strength. Because, while Jun-seok celebrated his victory, Hye-jin carried within her a life that would completely change the history he believed he controlled. After the devastating night at the Seoul ballroom, Lee Hye-jin left the city without looking back. The bag he carried was small, but it weighed as if it contained all the failures of a lifetime. He found refuge in Busan, away from the spotlight and cruel headlines that covered the victory of Lee Jun-seok next to Baek Ji-yeon there. In a small guest house by the sea, Hye-jin tried to rebuild not only her routine, but also the pieces of a broken heart. The mornings were silent, interrupted only by the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks of the harbor. But inside her, the silence was deafening. With each movement of the baby in her womb, she felt torn between the pain of abandonment and the hope that this new life would be her only reason to carry on. Her frail, tired body betrayed sleepless nights, tears that insisted on wetting her pillow, and a loneliness that weighed more heavily than any public judgment. The medical appointments were conducted in secret, without escorts, and the nurses' looks revealed both compassion and astonishment. After all, everyone in Busan already knew that this woman had come from Seoul, carrying a history of scandal and betrayal. Yet Hye-jin stood her ground, maintaining a quiet dignity that hid the despair that consumed her. There were nights when she thought about giving up, about simply abandoning the fight and letting herself sink into the pain. But whenever she placed her hands on her belly, she felt the small heartbeat, reminding her that she was not alone. The baby was her anchor, the only link between a humiliating past and a still uncertain future. On her darkest days, she would walk along the shore at dusk, watching families playing in the sand, couples smiling and children running free. The scene was a cruel reminder of what had been taken from her, but also a whisper of hope that one day she could give her son the life he deserved. and even torn apart, Hye-jin began to realize that pain could also be fuel, that the rejection that had driven her away from the capital could be transformed into strength to protect the child she carried. Her emotional breakdown wasn't the end, but rather the fertile ground for a new beginning, still unseen. What she couldn't have imagined was that, as she silently struggled to survive, Jun-seok and Ji-yeon's footsteps in Seoul were already slowly beginning to crumble. And soon, their paths would cross again, bringing to light secrets capable of changing everything. Time passed, and in Busan, Lee Hye-jin found ways to survive away from the luxurious life he once enjoyed alongside Lee Jun-seok. Without the privileges she had before, she had to learn to live with the bare minimum, sharing a small rented room and working as a private tutor to cover her own expenses and ensure a minimum of comfort for her soon-to-be-born son. The simplicity was a shock for someone who had previously been immersed in glamorous parties and international business meetings. But it also became her salvation. For the first time in years, Hye-jin could walk the streets without being followed by photographers or judged by the venomous stares of high society wives. In Busan, she was just another woman struggling to survive. And this brought her a strange peace, even if marked by invisible wounds. Between the textbooks she used for teaching and her students' scribbled notebooks, Hye-jin began to rediscover the value of routine. The shy laughter of a child learning a new word, the sparkle in the eyes of someone understanding a difficult lesson, all served as reminders that life could be meaningful even without the spotlight. Her belly grew, and with it, so did her determination to create a better future for the baby to come. While Hye-jin grew stronger in silence, in Seoul, the lives of Jun-seok and Baek Ji-yeon seemed to be taking a different path. Newspapers featured photos of the smiling couple at lavish dinners. Headlines proclaimed the arrival of the new heir to the Lee Empire, and to the public, their love story seemed a picture of victory. But behind the frozen smiles, the foundation of this new family was already showing its first cracks. The CEO, increasingly embroiled in corporate disputes, failed to notice Ji-yeon's expensive whims and manipulative behavior. And while he immersed himself in risky business ventures, believing success would never leave him, fate was already preparing the moment when all masks would fall. Hye-jin, unknowingly, was living her rebuilding phase just as Jun-seok's empire was heading for ruin. She didn't yet realize that her absence would be cruelly felt by the man who had discarded her, and that one day her quiet strength would return to confront all the pride that had crushed her. The reunion between these two worlds seemed distant, but it was already written to happen. And when it finally came, it wouldn't just be a meeting of glances, it would be the clash between reborn dignity and pride on the verge of collapse. While Lee Hye-jin was quietly rebuilt in Busan, away from the spotlight, the life of Lee Jun-seok in Seoul began to lose the luster it once boasted. At first, everything seemed perfect. Magazines featured the image of a power couple, shareholders applauded their speeches, and toasts at lavish dinners reinforced the idea that he had made the right choice in changing wives. But like any empire built on arrogance and lies, the first cracks began to silently appear, eroding the once solid foundation. Jun-seok, overconfident in his own abilities, made risky business decisions, betting on international expansions that drained the company's resources. At the same time, his obsession with pleasing Baek Ji-yeon led him to spend astronomical sums on gifts, real estate, and public appearances. The money seemed endless until reports began to show worrying numbers, and the most experienced partners began to question whether the new phase of the presidency was turning into a disaster waiting to happen. But what really accelerated the downfall was Ji-yeon's attitude. Now, Installed as the official wife and mother of the supposed heir, she believed she could control not only her husband, but also the company's destiny. Her interference in meetings was seen as reckless. Her arrogant comments alienated longtime partners, and employees began to whisper that she was nothing more than an opportunist who had found a platform to display her ego. Jun-seok, blinded by vanity, didn't realize how much it tarnished his image. His obsession with being seen as invincible prevented him from seeing that he was slowly isolating himself from all who had once been his allies. The phone no longer rang with important invitations. Contracts were taking longer to close, and the respect he had always commanded was beginning to turn into distrust. And then came the cruelest blow. Ji-yeon's baby, the one he had proclaimed to the world as his rightful heir, suddenly fell ill. The child had a rare condition, and doctors required a series of tests to confirm the appropriate treatment. What seemed like a medical emergency would turn into an earthquake in Jun-seok's life. The CEO, accustomed to solving everything with money and influence, believed it would be just another obstacle to overcome. However, the expert's serious tone made it clear that detailed genetic testing would be necessary, including not only the parents, but also any possible biological link. It was at that moment that Ji-yeon's gaze wavered, revealing a shadow of fear that few noticed, but which foretold a secret capable of ruining not only a marriage, but an entire reputation. Jun-seok didn't suspect anything. To him, this was just another challenge, a stumbling block on his triumphant journey. But fate, silent and relentless, was already setting the stage for the revelation that would change everything. Because soon, within the cold walls of a hospital, he would meet the gaze of Hye-jin, the woman he despised, without imagining that it would be precisely from her that the truth that would destroy him in front of everyone would come. The Seoul hospital was dead silent that morning. When Lee Jun-seok walked down the hall with heavy steps, his face filled with concern for the baby he believed to be his heir. Beside him, Baek Ji-yeon, he maintained a tense air, his trembling hands hidden beneath his designer handbag. It was the first time the powerful CEO had shown himself vulnerable in front of so many. But the situation required more than money and influence. The doctor in charge of the case had made it clear, for the treatment to be effective, it was essential to confirm the genetic compatibility between father, mother, and child. Jun-seok never doubted his paternity for a single moment. With the arrogance of someone who believed he controlled destiny, he signed the exam papers as if it were merely a formality. However, it was in that same hospital, right in front of the waiting room, that fate, relentless in its reckoning, brought back the figure he least expected to encounter. Lee Hye-jin stood there, serene, but with a firm gaze that betrayed the strength gained during months of silence. She wore simple clothes, but there was a dignity in her posture that not even the cruelest humiliation could erase. Seeing her, Jun-seok felt an involuntary shiver. Time seemed to have stopped, as if past and present collided before the curious gazes that turned to this unexpected reunion. Ji-yeon, for her part, paled. The calculated smile faded from her face, replaced by an expression of concealed dread. It was as if she knew Hye-jin's presence was no mere coincidence, but rather the harbinger of a revelation that could destroy everything she had built on lies. The doctor, unaware of the invisible tension in the air, explained that it would be necessary to expand the examination, collecting blood samples from everyone involved to be absolutely certain of the results. The request, seemingly technical and objective, fell like a bombshell among the three. Hye-jin discreetly held a manila envelope in her hand, the same one she had carried since the scene at the hospital months earlier, and her impassive expression made it clear she was ready to weather the storm. Jun-seok, still trying to maintain his composure, approached her with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. For the first time since his divorce, he realized he wasn't standing before the submissive woman he'd publicly humiliated, but rather someone who had survived rejection and returned transformed. There was something in her gaze that unnerved him more than any business crisis. In that instant, the hospital corridor became the stage for a silent drama. The white walls seemed to absorb every sigh, every exchanged glance, every pent-up tension. And while the doctor collected the necessary signatures, fate cruelly and precisely adjusted its pieces. Because soon, the examination would reveal a truth that would forever change not only Jun-seok's life, but also the image he had built before the world. The meeting hadn't just been an emotional shock, it was the harbinger of a devastating revelation. And when the outcome came to light, no mask would be able to hide the lie that sustained Jun-seok's empire. The days following the reunion were marked by agonizing anticipation. The Seoul hospital became the center of attention for the press, which sought at all costs to capture any details about the heir to the empire. Within the cold walls, however, the tension was unbearable. Lee Jun-seok paced back and forth, his expression heavy, trying to convince himself that the result would be just a formality, another confirmation of his greatness. Beside him, Baek Ji-yeon avoided his gaze, fearing that a simple gesture would betray the secrets she so desperately guarded. On the morning of the delivery, the doctor entered the room with a neutral but firm expression. He held a thick white envelope that seemed to contain not only medical reports but also the weight of destiny. When he placed the envelope on the table, silence fell. The air was heavy, each breath seemed to echo, and anxiety turned seconds into hours. Impatiently, Jun-seok tore the seal with his bare hands and began reading the printed lines. At first, his eyes narrowed as if trying to better understand the words, but as he continued, his face lost its color. Sweat broke out on his forehead, his breathing became ragged, and his hands trembled with disbelief. Finally, the words escaped his lips in a hoarse whisper that sounded as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. No, that can't be true. The report was clear, indisputable, irrefutable. Ji-yeon's baby was not biologically Lee Jun-seok's son. The revelation fell like a death sentence on the perfect image he had built. Every party, every speech, every public appearance with his lover now seemed like a grotesque farce. Ji-yeon, panicked, tried to justify herself. Her words came out in a rush, full of apologies and tears, but nothing could erase the weight of the lie she had sustained. Jun-seok's gaze, once filled with pride as he displayed her like a trophy, was now one of pure contempt. The woman he had placed on a pedestal was transforming before his eyes into a threat, the one responsible for the ruin that was beginning to unfold. But the twist didn't stop there. The test, besides denying paternity, revealed something even more shocking. Jun-seok's only biological child was actually his baby, Lee. Hye-jin, the woman he had mercilessly discarded and humiliated. The official document not only disavowed the mistress, but also restored to his ex-wife the position that had been forcibly taken from her. Hye-jin remained silent throughout the reading. Her expression expressed not vengeance but dignity. It was as if she had waited for this moment, not to exact revenge, but to prove to the world that the truth always finds a way to emerge. Her eyes met Jun-seok's, and for a moment he seemed to shrink before her, like a man finally realizing the depth of his fall. The revelation wasn't confined to the hospital walls. Soon, the news leaked out, spreading through newspapers and social media. The heir, announced with such fanfare, was nothing more than a hoax. And society, applauding Jun-seok alongside Ji-yeon, now saw him as a symbol of blind arrogance and public deceit. The humiliation, once destined for Hye-jin, now fell upon him with a multiplied weight. Partners questioned his ability. Shareholders talked of ousting him, and the looks of disapproval became more painful than any cruel headline. Jun-seok, disoriented, tried to react, but every word was drowned out by the scandal. While Ji-yeon struggled in despair, Hye-jin stood firm, as if finally regaining not only her dignity, but also the certainty that her pain had not been in vain. And while that outcome was devastating for Jun-seok, he still had no idea that the true trial was just beginning. Because faced with this loss, his next decision would determine whether he had any chance of redemption or whether he would plunge into his own ruin. After the devastating revelation at the hospital, Lee Jun-seok spent days plunged into silence. The pride that had sustained his life had been shattered in public, reduced to dust before watchful, judgmental eyes. Now only the shadow of a man, unsure of how to regain what he had lost, remained. Someone realizing for the first time that power, wealth, and influence could not repair the void he had created. In his mind, there was only one constant, painful, and crystal-clear image. Lee Hye-jin holding her son in her arms, firm and dignified, while he, helpless, crumbled before everyone, unable to control what had become irreversible. Every detail of that moment ran through his memory like sharp blades, reminding him of every choice that had led him there. For the first time in years, Jun-seok swallowed the arrogance that had always sustained him and decided to find his way to the small house in Busan where Hye-jin now lived. There were no security guards opening doors, no photographers recording every step, no applause or envious glances. There was just him, alone, carrying flowers in one hand, the weight of regret on his face, as if each step was sapping some of his strength. The walk through the silent streets felt long, and the cool breeze blowing off the sea seemed to whisper memories of the past, reminding him of lost opportunities and time he could not get back. Hye-jin opened the door slowly, surprised to see him standing there, hesitant. But his gaze betrayed no nostalgia, no tenderness or longing, only firmness, like someone who'd learned to survive without relying on anyone. Jun-seok tried to speak, but his voice faltered, choked with the fear of not being understood, the belated recognition of his own failings. He began again, swallowing the lump in his throat and trying to articulate words that could bridge years of emotional distance. I was wrong. I was wrong with you. I was wrong with our son. Give me a chance to make amends. Hye-jin remained completely silent, uninterrupted. He knelt, his eyes brimming with tears, begging for a forgiveness he believed could erase past mistakes. But when he finally responded, his voice was calm, firm, and cutting. It's not about you anymore. It's about our son, and he doesn't need a father who rejected him before he was even born. The words fell upon Jun-seok like a final blow, piercing every layer of his arrogance and pride. All the power, all the money, all the influence he had accumulated over the years meant nothing compared to the determination of a woman who had chosen to move forward, immune to the manipulations he knew so well. He tried to insist, but found only a closed door, a symbol of a heart that would not be deceived again. As he walked through the narrow streets of Busan, Jun-seok felt each step weigh heavy, as if carrying the entire world. He realized he was no longer the feared and respected man he once was. He was simply someone trying to hold on to the remnants of a past that could never be recovered. Every corner, every light in the city reflected his silent defeat. And although he had lost the love of his ex-wife, fate, cruel in its precision, still had more pain in store, because he was about to watch, helpless, Hye-jin's rise to a place that had once belonged only to him, and with each of her achievements, he would feel reflected in His own life, the price of his choices, and the strength of someone who knew how to carry on, unwavering. Time passed, and while Lee Jun-seok was drowning in scandals and loneliness, Lee Hye-jin found a path to rebirth. The silence that once seemed like a prison became her greatest weapon. With the support of former business partners who always recognized her intelligence and common sense, she founded an early childhood education foundation in Seoul, aimed at children in vulnerable situations. The Saka institution's launch was a milestone. The auditorium was packed with investors, professors, officials, and even journalists who remembered the public humiliation Hye-jin had suffered months earlier. Now, before everyone, she appeared no longer as the abandoned wife, but as an independent woman, master of her own story. The most symbolic detail was the chosen location. The building where the foundation operated had previously belonged to the Lee conglomerate, but had been hastily sold during a financial crisis caused by Jun-seok's mismanagement. The image of Hye-jin delivering her speech on stage, elegant and serene, was broadcast nationwide on television. Cameras captured the strength in her gaze and the firmness in her words as she spoke about providing opportunities for children who, like her son, deserved a dignified and protected future. The audience gave a standing ovation, moved, recognizing in her not just a victim of betrayal, but a leader capable of transforming pain into hope. On the other side of the screen, in his silent penthouse, Jun-seok watched in complete silence. With every word Hye-jin spoke, he felt as if his defeat were being sealed before the entire country. This woman, whom he had rejected, now occupied a place of honor that not all his money could buy back. Hye-jin didn't look back, didn't mention his name, but her presence lingered in every sentence, like a ghost, reminding the CEO that true strength lay not in power, but in dignity. What was once an empire of arrogance now became the stage for the silent victory of a woman who refused to be destroyed. And as the applause echoed through the auditorium, one last scene was still waiting to seal Jun-seok's doom, showing him that no matter how hard he tried, there was no turning back. In the solitude of his luxurious penthouse in Seoul, Lee Jun-seok, he stared at the cold walls that had once been the scene of parties, gatherings, and conquests. The space, once filled with fawning guests, was now merely a reflection of its ruin. The silence mingled with the muffled sound of rain against the enormous windows, as if the city itself were reminding him that nothing he had arrogantly built had withstood the weight of truth. Sitting in a leather armchair, his eyes red and his face lined with fatigue, he held an untouched glass of wine. The television was on, broadcasting the Social Leadership Awards live. And there, on the main stage, was Lee Hye-jin, dressed with the same understated elegance that had always characterized her, but now carrying with her the aura of someone who had conquered. Beside her, holding his mother's hand with innocence and pride, was the boy who represented not only the future, but also the justice that fate had imposed. Hye-jin's words filled the auditorium and penetrated the screen to Jun-seok's heart. She spoke of courage, resilience, and the importance of not giving up, even when the world tries to crush our dignity. Each sentence was like a mirror, in which he saw his own arrogance reflected. Each applause, a reminder that the woman he had scorned had found the strength to rise above all the pain. He tried to stand, but his legs were heavy. Tears fell silently, and for the first time, Jun-seok wept, not for the loss of power, but for the knowledge that he had squandered what truly mattered. The son he never knew, the wife he had humiliated, the family he had traded for an illusion. It was all beyond his reach, and nothing in the world could buy it back. Meanwhile, Hye-jin concluded her speech with a light smile, without rancor, only the certainty that she had overcome every wound. Her gaze didn't search the past, but turned to the future, to the sun holding her hand and the dreams that were now possible. The contrast between the stage lights and the darkness of the lonely rooftop was the final proof that Jun-seok's pride had been defeated by Hye-jin's silent resilience. In that moment, their fate was sealed. He, trapped in regret, and she, free to move forward, proving that no humiliation can stop those who learn to transform pain into strength. And so the story came to an end, not just as a tale of betrayal and downfall, but as a powerful reminder that justice may be delayed, but it always comes. If this story has touched your heart and captivated you thus far, subscribe to the channel now. We have many more exciting stories waiting for you, and the next one promises to be even more intense than this one. Don't miss the next chapter. Click here, subscribe, and come experience every emotion with us.